Death Behind Bars. The Brian Tetrault Neglect Case. 2001, New York, USA. Behind the walls of New York's Schenectady County Jail, a man was dying, and no one seemed to notice. Not the officers who walked past his cell. Not the medical staff who dismissed his worsening symptoms. Not the system that claimed to uphold justice, but instead looked away until it was too late. Tonight, we examine a case many Americans have never heard of, yet one that exposes a silent crisis in U.S. correctional facilities: death by neglect. Brian Tetrault wasn't a violent criminal. He wasn't a hardened offender. He was a former U.S. Army tank commander, a father, and a man struggling with advanced Parkinson's disease, a condition that required constant care, not confinement. But inside that jail, care became indifference. Medical oversight became paperwork, and his suffering became a death sentence. For 10 days, Brian deteriorated before the eyes of those sworn to protect him. His body trembled. His speech faded. His mobility vanished. Yet instead of receiving treatment, he was labeled uncooperative, dismissed as faking, and written off as a troublemaker. What happened in that cell wasn't a mystery. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't unavoidable. It was a slow-motion death caused by neglect that was treatable, preventable, and fully visible. And when he died, the cover-up began. False reports, fabricated timelines, a system scrambling to protect itself rather than acknowledge its failures. This episode dives into what really happened behind those steel doors: the medical failures, the ignored warnings, the institutional denial, and the outrage that followed when the truth finally surfaced. If you're new here, welcome to Dark Truth 25, where we examine the real stories that challenge justice, expose corruption, and reveal the darker side of human systems. If you're returning, you already know how deep we go. Before we continue, please support the channel. Like, share, and comment your thoughts. Your engagement helps the algorithm push stories like this into the light. And yes, we welcome criticism too. It makes us stronger. Now, let's step into the cell where everything went wrong. The final days of Brian Tetrault. It was a cold November morning in 2001 when Brian Tetrault arrived at Broome County Jail, a man whose health was fragile, yet whose fate was about to be sealed by indifference. Brian, a former tank commander, had spent years serving his country. Parkinson's disease, a relentless degenerative illness, had begun to dictate his life. Tremors, rigidity, and moments of sudden imbalance marked his daily routine. Yet, nothing in his past could prepare him for the indifference he would face behind bars. On paper, Brian's arrest was minor, a misdemeanor charge stemming from a domestic dispute. But the reality of incarceration for a man with severe medical needs was far more dangerous. From the moment he stepped into the jail, the warning signs were clear. He moved slowly, relying on a cane, each step betraying the toll Parkinson's had taken. His speech occasionally faltered, his handwriting trembled, and he expressed anxiety over the lack of medical oversight. Within the first 48 hours, staff noted minor complaints, headaches, dizziness, inability to sleep, but dismissed them as exaggerations. Shift logs show repeated references to Brian as fussy or complaining, a language that would soon prove lethal. These were not mere minor ailments. They were the first cracks in a system unprepared to care for the vulnerable. By the third day, Brian's condition had worsened visibly. Inmates recall him struggling to stand, his movements jerky, his voice weaker. Requests for basic necessities, medication, assistance walking, hydration, went largely unanswered. A single nurse, overwhelmed with dozens of inmates, documented symptoms in passing, with no follow-up. Officers, trained for control, not care, saw a man who moved differently and concluded he was pretending, perhaps seeking attention. The jail, understaffed and underfunded, lacked a dedicated medical wing. No neurologist was on call. The on-site nurse had minimal training in neurodegenerative disorders. And yet, protocols required that serious complaints be escalated immediately. In Brian's case, they were not. By the fifth day, Brian's body began to betray him more dramatically. Tremors intensified, coordination failed, and simple tasks like drinking water or walking to the cell became perilous. Witnesses later recounted seeing him fall against the bars, weak and disoriented, yet no immediate medical intervention occurred. Calls for help, shouted from the neighboring cells, were met with indifference or reassurances that he'll be fine. Family members who visited noticed the change immediately. Brian appeared hollowed, anxious, and desperate for someone to acknowledge the severity of his condition. They would leave shaken, unaware that within a week, their warnings would go tragically unheeded. As this chapter closes, we confront the chilling reality. Brian Tetrault's final days were not marked by a sudden accident or unforeseen complication. They were defined by preventable neglect, by a system that failed to recognize vulnerability, failed to act, and ultimately allowed a man to die within its walls. The stage was set for the calamity that would follow, a story of oversight, omission, and indifference that would haunt the county and ripple through New York's correctional system. Arrest, diagnosis, and vulnerability. Brian Tetrault's arrest may have seemed minor to the outside world, but for a man already battling a debilitating disease, it was catastrophic. A former tank commander, he had spent years in environments of discipline and precision. Parkinson's disease, however, was a relentless adversary that no military training could counter. Tremors, stiffness, and the slow loss of motor control marked his daily reality. But now, suddenly, he was at the mercy of a jail system completely unprepared for someone like him. The charges against Brian were relatively minor, a misdemeanor involving a domestic dispute. Yet the circumstances of his arrest illuminated a stark contrast between the law's indifference and his medical vulnerability. Officers arriving at his home noticed his tremors, the visible difficulty in movement, and his need for medication, details that should have been flagged immediately. But paperwork and protocol rarely accounted for human frailty. Brian was processed like any other detainee, a routine check-in that ignored his fragility. From the start, his vulnerability was apparent. Parkinson's disease is more than trembling hands. It is a progressive illness that attacks balance, speech, and the ability to perform even basic daily tasks. Brian's medication regimen was precise and timed, critical to keeping his symptoms in check. Being placed in a cell with no medical supervision disrupted everything. He was isolated from a system designed for healthy adults, not a man whose life literally depended on attention to his health. In interviews later conducted with jail staff, many admitted they were aware of his condition, yet few understood the implications. Notes indicate that some officers were unsure how to assist him, while others dismissed his complaints entirely. "He'll be fine," one log read. "Needs to toughen up," said another. It was a pattern that would persist, a bureaucratic echo of negligence that blurred the line between oversight and recklessness. Brian's vulnerability was compounded by the limitations of the jail's medical system. On site, there was no specialist familiar with neurodegenerative disorders. Nurses were overworked, balancing dozens of inmates with varying medical needs. Doctors visited infrequently, and records show that follow-up on Brian's condition was sporadic at best. Even routine tasks, receiving medication, walking to the medical unit, became fraught with danger. Family members who had known Brian's struggles watched in disbelief. They pleaded with the jail to provide adequate care, to allow adjustments to his confinement, and to ensure that someone would be watching him closely. Their warnings went largely unheeded. In the stark fluorescent lights of the jail, Brian's vulnerability became increasingly visible. Yet still, action was minimal. By the end of this chapter, the framework for tragedy is unmistakable. A man already weakened by illness was arrested and placed into a system ill-equipped to safeguard him. His vulnerability was not theoretical. It was tangible, observed, and yet systematically ignored. The consequences of this negligence would soon set the stage for the fatal days to follow, where a combination of bureaucracy, misjudgment, and apathy would converge into catastrophe. A jail unprepared for the sick. By the time Brian Tetrault entered Broome County Jail, The institution's weaknesses were already baked into its walls. It was not just an issue of overcrowding or a lack of security. The medical system inside the facility was chronically underfunded, understaffed, and unprepared to handle inmates with serious health conditions. For Brian, a man battling Parkinson's disease, this lack of preparedness would prove deadly. The jail's medical unit consisted of a small nurse's office with minimal equipment and no on-site physician. Nurses were responsible for dozens of inmates at any given time, many of whom had complex health needs, from diabetes to chronic heart conditions. Documentation shows that the medical team was overworked, with little time to monitor patients closely, let alone respond swiftly to emergencies. In theory, there were protocols for triaging inmates in critical condition. In practice, these were inconsistently applied. From the moment Brian expressed discomfort or requested medication, red flags should have been raised. Parkinson's disease requires careful monitoring, precise medication schedules, and immediate attention when symptoms escalate. Yet the logs reveal repeated delays, missed doses, and minimal follow-up. Officers were ill-equipped to identify serious medical deterioration, treating complaints as behavioral problems rather than health emergencies. Staff training, or lack thereof, played a significant role. Many corrections officers had received only cursory instruction in medical emergencies, primarily focused on CPR or basic first aid. Neurological disorders like Parkinson's, which affect motor control and cognition in subtle ways, were far outside their expertise. This gap between what the staff could recognize and what Brian needed created a dangerous blind spot. Interviews with former inmates later painted a stark picture. They described fellow prisoners falling ill, pleading for help, and being ignored, a culture where medical crises were deferred until they became severe. Brian's case was emblematic of this systemic failure. His tremors, difficulty walking, and loss of coordination were visible to all, yet the response remained inadequate. Even routine documentation highlights inconsistencies. Medication logs show discrepancies in timing and dosage. Nurse notes failed to correlate with observed symptoms. When multiple staff were on shift, no single person took responsibility for following up. The bureaucracy created a dangerous inertia. Responsibility diffused, accountability lost, and a man's health deteriorated in plain sight. By the end of this chapter, the reality is clear. Broome County Jail was a facility built for containment, not care. Its medical system was not merely inadequate. It was dangerously ill-suited for inmates like Brian Tetrault. His declining health, ignored and misunderstood, foreshadowed a tragedy that could have been prevented had protocols been enforced, staffing increased, and compassion applied. He's faking it, the deadly misjudgment. From the moment Brian Tetrault entered Broome County Jail, his symptoms were obvious: tremors, rigid muscles, difficulty walking, slurred speech, and a constant struggle with balance. For anyone familiar with Parkinson's disease, these were classic signs of a body slowly losing control. But inside the jail, these symptoms were seen through a very different lens, one shaped by skepticism, routine, and a culture that often equated vulnerability with manipulation. And that culture would seal Brian's fate. The shift in perception. In the early days of Brian's confinement, officers recorded his symptoms as complaints or behavioral issues. But as his condition worsened, so did the tone of the reports. Log entries began describing him as dramatic, uncooperative, or simply faking it. One officer wrote, "Inmate appears to exaggerate movements." Another noted, "Claims he can't walk but got up earlier." This shift wasn't rooted in medical assessment. It was rooted in convenience. In a setting where hundreds of inmates demanded attention, a sick inmate became an inconvenience. An inconvenience often turned into suspicion. A system that prefers simplicity over complexity. Neurological disorders like Parkinson's are unpredictable. Symptoms fluctuate hour by hour. A man who can stand in the morning might collapse by afternoon. A hand that shakes violently one moment might appear steady the next. But the jail staff, untrained in these complexities, interpreted this variability as deception. Several officers later admitted they believed Brian was trying to gain special treatment. Some thought he wanted a transfer to the medical unit. Others assumed he was trying to avoid regular duties or simply seeking pity. This assumption, made without medical evaluation, shaped every response he received. Witness accounts that went ignored. Inmates living near Brian witnessed the truth firsthand. They saw him struggle to lift a cup of water, shake uncontrollably while sitting on his bunk, or freeze mid-step due to muscle rigidity. More than once, neighboring inmates shouted for help when Brian fell. Their warnings were brushed aside. Inside the jail hierarchy, inmate testimony carried little weight. It was seen as self-serving, manipulative, or irrelevant. So even when they said something is wrong with him, it made no difference. Medical staff caught in the middle. The jail's medical staff were stretched thin, responsible for dozens of cases a day. Nurses noted some symptoms, but had limited time to follow up. Without consistent monitoring and with no neurological specialist on call, evaluations were superficial and fragmented. A nurse might see Brian during a brief check, observe him sitting still, and assume the earlier tremors had been exaggerated. Another nurse might catch him during a rigid, freezing episode and document severe decline, but these entries were inconsistent and rarely compared across shifts. This disconnect between medical and correctional staff created a vacuum in which assumptions were treated as facts. And in that vacuum, the dangerous idea that Brian was pretending became the dominant narrative. Moments that should have changed everything. There were several critical points where intervention could have saved Brian's life. When he collapsed near the bars and could not get up. When he could no longer walk without assistance. When he stopped eating properly and visibly lost weight. When he slurred his words and struggled to respond to simple questions. When his hands shook so violently he couldn't hold a tray. Each of these was documented, sometimes by staff, often by inmates. Yet none triggered emergency action. Instead, officers interpreted these signs as tactics. They believed he was acting weak. They believed he was playing sick. They believed he was trying to get out of jail responsibilities. And so, the more Brian deteriorated, the less seriously he was taken. The power of a label. Once the label faker was pinned on Brian, every symptom was filtered through that bias. If he couldn't walk, it was refusal. If he couldn't speak clearly, it was noncompliance. If he fell, it was carelessness. If he trembled, it was dramatic behavior. This is one of the deadliest aspects of institutional neglect. When an inmate is labeled as manipulative, their humanity becomes invisible. Family warnings dismissed. Brian's family, aware of the severity of his condition, repeatedly tried to warn the jail. They explained the importance of his medication schedule, the reality of sudden motor freezing, and the need for supervision. They were told, "We're monitoring him." They were told, "He's fine." But as the days passed, the distance between what the family knew and what the jail believed became a chasm no one tried to bridge. The final turning point, a deadly misjudgment, becomes fatal. By the end of this chapter, Brian's health had spiraled. What staff interpreted as acting was actually his body shutting down. What they called dramatic behavior were neurological symptoms screaming for medical intervention. But by then, the narrative was set in stone. Staff believed he was faking. Protocols were ignored. Warning signs were rationalized. And the man who desperately needed help was left to deteriorate in plain sight. This single misinterpretation, made casually, repeated frequently, and never challenged, became the foundation of a tragedy that would soon unfold in full force. The collapse, from medical crisis to death. In the final days of Brian Tetrault's life, the signs of medical crisis were no longer subtle or debatable or open to interpretation. They were severe, unmistakable, and impossible for any trained, or even untrained, observer to ignore. His body was failing, system by system, hour by hour. But inside Broome County Jail, the collapse unfolded slowly, painfully, and disastrously, with no one stepping forward to stop it. A body entering crisis. By this stage, Brian's Parkinson's disease had accelerated rapidly due to missed medication, stress, dehydration, and untreated symptoms. He became unable to regulate his movements. His balance deteriorated sharply. His speech weakened until words became slurred, fragmented, difficult to form. He struggled to lift objects. He struggled to stand. He struggled to respond to questions. And yet, to the jail staff who had already branded him as a faker, these were not warnings. They were annoyances. Shift logs from this period show a chilling disconnect between reality and perception. Inmate slow to respond. Inmate unsteady but able. Appears to exaggerate weakness. Claims fatigue again. The language is cold. The understanding is shallow. And the consequences, irreversible. The day his body gave out. At some point, no one can pinpoint the exact hour Brian's body reached breaking point. He became unable to walk without assistance. His legs buckled beneath him. His muscles seized in rigid spasms. Even with support, he struggled to stay upright. His gaze became unfocused, pupils sluggish, his skin pale and clammy. These are classic signs of neurological emergency. Yet staff continued to treat him as if he were simply being difficult. One officer later admitted, "I thought he just didn't want to walk." Another said, "We'd seen inmates put on a show before. I assumed this was the same." Every assumption nudged Brian one step closer to catastrophe, a fall that should have changed everything. Witnesses reported that Brian collapsed more than once. Inmates banged on their cell doors, shouting for help. Some tried to reach him through the bars, urging him to sit, to breathe, to stay conscious. One inmate later said, "We knew something was wrong, man. He was shaking, then he wasn't moving." Nobody came. When officers finally did arrive, they used the same explanation they'd used for days. He's refusing to stand. He's playing weak. He's doing this on purpose. The tragedy wasn't just that the staff misjudged him. It's that they clung to that misjudgment even as his body shut down in front of them. Basic needs ignored. As Brian spiraled downward, even basic bodily functions became challenging. He stopped eating properly. He stopped drinking enough water. He became severely dehydrated. His medication doses, already inconsistent, were now functionally non-existent. Without them, symptoms that should have been managed grew catastrophic. Muscle rigidity, tremors, confusion, slowed heart rate, and dangerously low dopaminergic function. To any medical professional, Brian's condition would have screamed medical emergency. Inside the jail, it was just another shift. The moment it became too late. On the day Brian's crisis reached its peak, several officers attempted to move him. He couldn't lift himself, couldn't control his limbs, could barely respond. Instead of taking him to the medical unit, officers attempted to drag or support him down the corridor, still believing he was pretending. He collapsed again. This time, he didn't get back up. Only then, too late, did staff finally call for medical assistance. But the delay had already done its damage. Brian was critically dehydrated, his muscles locked stiff, his vital signs unstable. His body was shutting down. Nurses attempted to revive him, but their equipment and training were limited. Minutes ticked by, minutes in which paramedics weren't called, minutes in which protocols weren't followed, minutes in which Brian's life hung by a thread. When emergency responders finally arrived, they were shocked at his condition. He was unresponsive. He was severely dehydrated. His body temperature was dangerously low. His muscles were rigid from untreated Parkinson's deterioration. The ambulance transported him to the hospital, where doctors immediately recognized the severity of his crisis. They described him as desperately ill and critically neglected, but their efforts came too late. Brian Tetrault died shortly after, a death that should never have happened. In the hours following his death, questions began to surface. How did a man visibly deteriorating receive no emergency treatment? Why did staff insist he was faking despite overwhelming evidence? How could so many red flags be dismissed? Why was no doctor called earlier? Why was no neurological specialist consulted? Why was the ambulance not called until he was already nearing death? The answers point to a heartbreaking truth. Brian didn't die from Parkinson's disease. He died from neglect. He died from disbelief. He died because the people responsible for protecting him convinced themselves he wasn't worth protecting. The collapse that turned a case into a scandal. Brian's death was not a quiet, isolated tragedy. It became a headline, a lawsuit, a point of outrage, a symbol of everything wrong with jail medical care. Because once investigators began piecing together the timeline, the collapse wasn't seen as inevitable. It was preventable. It was foreseeable. It was a crisis ignored until it became a corpse. And as we move forward, the story only becomes darker, because after Brian died, something even more disturbing happened. People began rewriting the narrative. Logs changed. Reports shifted. Details vanished. A cover-up in motion. By the time Brian Tetrault was lying on the cold floor of his cell, unable to stand, unable to speak, and barely able to move, the people responsible for his care were already preparing for something else entirely. A narrative. A story. A version of events that would distance them from blame, shield them from scrutiny, and ultimately bury the truth. This chapter is not just about what happened to Brian. It is about what happened after. The rapid, coordinated, and chilling attempt to rewrite his final days. 1. The first red flags in the paperwork. Every inmate interaction is supposed to generate a trail, logbooks, medical slips, observation notes, daily reports. But once investigators began examining Brian's records, it became clear that the trail wasn't just incomplete, it had been tampered with. Cut to reenactment. Correctional officer writing notes, then scratching them out, rewriting. Vital signs, missing medication logs, strangely, normal observation entries written hours after they supposedly happened conflicting times between medical and custody staff. It was as if different parts of a jail had lived in different versions of reality. 2. He was fine this morning. The rehearse line. One of the first patterns investigators noticed was the repetition. Nearly every staff member, when questioned, used the same phrase. He was fine earlier. Cut to quick jump cuts between officers repeating identical statements. But surveillance timing, inmate testimony, and even physical evidence contradicted this. Brian hadn't been fine in days. His decline was visible, audible, undeniable. So where did this oddly consistent line come from? A former officer, voice actor, delivers a hypothetical insight. When something goes wrong, people talk in the break room. Stories start to align. That's just how it is. Or perhaps that's how it's taught. 3. The falsified medical logs. Cut to shot of medical paperwork with timestamps blurred. Some of the most disturbing discrepancies came from the medical notes. According to the logs, Brian had been assessed multiple times. They claimed he was responsive, hydrated, taking medications on schedule. But the autopsy revealed something profoundly different. Dehydration, untreated symptoms, and evidence suggesting he had not received crucial medications. The contradiction was fatal and unmistakable. 4. The van ride that raised questions. When Brian was finally transported to the hospital, witnesses later recalled he was limp, cold, and barely conscious. But the transport forms described him as awake and stable. Cut to dramatized shot of officers lifting a motionless man into a van. This single falsified form delayed the hospital's understanding of the emergency, clouding the timeline and confusing medical staff. Once again, paperwork was being used not to document reality, but to distort it. 5. A meeting behind closed doors. Several hours after Brian was admitted to the hospital, but before he died, multiple staff members reportedly gathered in a small administrative room inside the jail. Door closes. Muffled voices. Phone logs suggest calls were made. Reports were rewritten. Some entries in the logbook appear to have been added after this meeting took place, though the times were backdated. This wasn't panic. This was coordination. 6. Staff silence and staff fear. Not everyone agreed to stay quiet. Some staff members, anonymously, told investigators that they felt pressured to keep things consistent. Others said they feared retaliation. You don't cross the line, not unless you won't lose your job. Or worse, be the next one blamed. This wasn't just institutional failure. It was institutional culture. 7. Why the cover-up matters. The story of Brian Tetrault's death is tragic enough. But the cover-up, the attempt to sanitize, rewrite, and manipulate the truth, turns a tragedy into a betrayal. Brian was already vulnerable, already sick, already ignored. But when the people responsible realized the consequences of their neglect, they chose not accountability, but self-preservation. 8. The system designed to protect itself. It is here, in Chapter 6, that Brian's story becomes bigger than Brian, bigger than Broome County, bigger than one jail, one staff member, or one shift. Because the cover-up reveals something deeper, a system that instinctively shields itself from blame, even if that means sacrificing the truth. Fade to black. And that instinct would shape everything that came next. The investigation, the lawsuits, and the fight for answers that Brian's family would never stop demanding. The body that told the real story. When Brian Tetrault arrived at the hospital, he was already beyond saving. His body, rigid, cold, and unresponsive, was the final piece of evidence in a case filled with silence, contradictions, and deliberate omissions. If the jail documents tried to rewrite the story, the autopsy exposed the truth. 1. The first medical observations, a body in crisis. Cut to reenactment. ER staff rushing, monitors beeping. Doctors immediately noticed signs that didn't match the jail's reports. They had been told he was alert, hydrated, stable. But Brian's physical condition told a very different story. Sunken eyes extremely low, body temperature dry, mucous membrane stiff, muscles minimal vital responses. He didn't look like someone who had been fine earlier. He looked like someone who had been suffering for days. 2. The autopsy begins. Cut to sterile white room, gloved hands, clinical tools. When a medical examiner began the autopsy, the first findings were subtle, but devastating. Severe dehydration, no evidence of recent medication protein breakdown in muscles, a sign of prolonged immobility and neglect. Pressure marks and abrasions indicating he had been unable to move himself. Each detail contradicted the version of events provided by jail staff. Each observation peeled away another layer of the cover-up. 3. The missing medication. Cut to close-up, pill bottles, empty blister packs, notes. Brian suffered from Parkinson's disease, a condition that requires precise and continuous medication. Without it, the body stiffens, the muscles lock, and even simple movements become impossible. According to jail logs, Brian was receiving his medication on schedule. According to his body, he wasn't. Blood levels showed. Far below therapeutic range signs, he had missed multiple doses over several days. This wasn't a medical slip. This was medical abandonment. 4. The dehydration, a slow, preventable death. The deeper the exam went, the more obvious the dehydration became. No fluid in the stomach, signs of severe electrolyte imbalance, blood thickening consistent with prolonged lack of water. Dehydration is not subtle. It is visible, measurable, painfully obvious to anyone trained to recognize it. Yet, somehow, no one in the jail noticed. Or perhaps no one cared to. 5. The injuries that raise questions. There were also marks on Brian's body, small but significant. Bruises along the arms, abrasions on knees, and elbows, early signs of pressure sores. These suggested one thing. Brian had been struggling, crawling, falling, trying to move when his muscles would no longer obey him. Cut to reenactment. A man collapsing, unable to stand. Inmates later reported seeing him so weak he dragged himself across the floor. The autopsy confirmed their accounts and exposed the lies written in the official reports. 6. The autopsy versus the logbook, point-by-point collapse. When investigators compared the autopsy findings with the jail's logbook, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Logbook: inmate responsive. Inmate drank water. Inmate able to stand. Inmate took medication. Autopsy: unresponsive, clinically dehydrated muscles, locked by advanced Parkinson's, no medication detected. One of these sources was telling the truth. The other was building a defense. 7. A death ruled natural at first. Shockingly, Brian's death was initially classified as natural. The reasoning? Complications from Parkinson's disease. Cut to dramatic pause. But there is nothing natural about preventable dehydration. Nothing natural about the absence of required medication. Nothing natural about a man collapsing on a jail floor with no assistance. The family pushed back. Their lawyers pushed harder. And the truth began to emerge. 8. The turning point. Dehydration becomes the central evidence. The autopsy findings forced investigators to confront a possibility they had been avoiding. Brian didn't die from Parkinson's, he died from neglect. Cut to scrolling text over black. Cause of death amended. Complications from Parkinson's disease exacerbated by dehydration and medical neglect. It was the closest the system would come to an admission, and even then, it fell short of naming the true cause: human failure. 9. The body is a witness. Brian couldn't speak during his final hours. He couldn't ask for help. He couldn't stand, walk, or even lift his head. But in death, his body testified for him. The dehydration spoke, the untreated symptoms spoke, the bruises spoke, the absence of medication spoke. Where paperwork lied, the autopsy revealed. Where staff contradicted themselves, his body remained consistent. Where the system tried to conceal the truth, science uncovered it. 10. What the autopsy meant for the case. The autopsy didn't just expose neglect. It undermined every defensive claim the jail attempted to make. It disproved their timeline, it exposed their false reporting, it revealed the scale of inhumanity, it set the stage for lawsuits, investigations, and public outrage. Yet even with such evidence, the fight for accountability was only beginning. Fade to black, because in the next chapter, we uncover how the system responded or failed to respond when confronted with the undeniable truth. The investigation that should have sparked reform. When Brian Tetrault died in November 2001, the Broome County Jail prepared for questions. What they did not prepare for was the scrutiny. Because once the autopsy findings surfaced, the quiet, controlled narrative they had built began to unravel. And what followed was an investigation that revealed not only what happened to Brian, but what had been happening in that facility for years. 1. The first wave of questions. It started at the hospital. Doctors could not reconcile the jail's description of Brian's condition with what they saw on the table. Severe dehydration, muscle rigidity, clear signs of prolonged medical neglect. So they did what medical professionals are required to do. They reported it. This triggered the first official review, one that should have changed everything. 2. The Sheriff's Department conducts its own review. Cut to dimly lit office, folders being opened, papers shuffled. The Broome County Sheriff's Office quickly launched an internal investigation. But even from the start, there were cracks. Officers interviewed by their own supervisor's medical staff allowed to clarify their statements, jail documents still missing or mysteriously altered. It was not an independent review. It was the system investigating itself. And systems rarely incriminate themselves. 3. The conflicting statements. As investigators dug deeper, they encountered something troubling. Every staff member seemed to have a slightly different memory. Some said Brian was talking fine. Others said he was slow, but okay. A few admitted he was a bit sick. Not a single staff member acknowledged the severity of his decline, despite multiple witnesses and clear medical evidence. Cut to timeline graphic. Inmates report Brian collapsing, logs say inmates standing, officers recall no issues observed. The inconsistencies weren't small. They formed the foundation of a fractured, unreliable account. 4. The family's push for answers. Brian's family, still in shock from his sudden death, refused to accept vague explanations. They demanded an independent review. We see dramatized footage. Family members holding documents, a lawyer speaking at a press conference, reporters gathering around microphones. This pressure forced the state authorities to step in. And that's when the story began to shift. 5. The New York State Commission of Correction steps in. The Commission of Correction, responsible for oversight, launched a deeper probe. Their findings would be a turning point. Their report listed incorrect medical assessments, medication, failures ignored, symptoms improper, monitoring, serious staff negligence. For the first time, an official body admitted what the jail would not. Brian's death was preventable. 6. The medical review, a blistering indictment. The medical experts brought in by the commission were blunt. They described the jail's medical care as grossly inadequate. One doctor stated, "A man in Brian Tetrault's condition should never have been in a jail cell. He needed a hospital, not a holding unit." Another wrote, "The failure to administer essential Parkinson's medication directly contributed to his deterioration." Each expert report chipped away at the jail's defense until there was nothing left but negligence. 7. The jail tries to shift blame. Faced with growing evidence, the jail shifted strategies. Instead of denying neglect, they tried to minimize it. They blamed overcrowding staff, shortages, confusion about medication, Brian's medical complexity. But none of these excuses explained why signs of dehydration were ignored, why Brian was mocked by staff, why inmates had to beg for his condition to be taken seriously. The investigation wasn't just exposing incompetence, it was exposing culture. 8. The lawsuit forces more answers. The Tetrault family filed a wrongful death lawsuit. This wasn't just about compensation, it was about truth. Depositions revealed a nurse who admitted she never checked vital signs, officers who hadn't read Brian's medical file, a medic who claimed he didn't realize Parkinson's could be that serious, staff who openly called Brian a faker. Under oath, the story fell apart completely. 9. Public pressure and media attention. Cut to local news clips, protest signs, community meetings. For Broome County, this case became national embarrassment. Interviews, articles, editorials, all calling for accountability. Community members demanded new medical staff, updated protocols, better training, better oversight. Public outrage became louder than any bureaucratic excuse. 10. A system still resistant to change. Despite the findings, despite the outrage, and despite the evidence, reform came slowly. In fact, in the years following Brian's death, other inmates died under similar circumstances. Staff turnover, continued medical neglect remained a recurring issue. The investigation should have transformed the jail. Instead, it exposed a deeper truth. Systems like this don't change because of one death. They change when accountability is unavoidable. 11. What the investigation meant for Brian's legacy. Brian's death forced Broome County, New York State, and the entire correctional system to confront an uncomfortable reality. Vulnerable inmates were not being cared for. Not properly. Not humanely. His case led to mandatory review of medical procedures, pressure for better staff, training, increased oversight from the state, a renewed conversation about jail conditions. It was a step forward, but not enough to prevent the tragedies that would follow. 12. The chapter ends with a hard truth. The investigation uncovered what truly happened to Brian Tetrault, but it didn't bring him back. And it didn't fully fix the system that failed him. Fade out, jail hallway empty. Because in the next chapter, we look beyond Brian, at the other inmates whose deaths echoed the same pattern of neglect, silence, and institutional failure. Patterns of abuse, other inmates who died similarly. Brian Tetrault's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the tip of a much darker pattern, a pattern that had been quietly unfolding inside Broome County Jail long before he entered its doors and continued long after he left. To understand the full weight of what happened to Brian, we must look beyond his story to the other lives lost in disturbingly similar ways. 1. A jail with a growing death count. Cut to graphic, bar chart rising year by year. Across several years, Broome County Jail recorded a disproportionate number of inmate deaths. Many were labeled natural, others accidental. But under closer scrutiny, the circumstances felt eerily familiar. Dehydration, ignored symptoms, delayed medical attention, missing paperwork, inconsistent staff statements. Brian's death didn't reveal a single failure. It revealed a culture of failure. 2. The case of Edwin "Eddie" Grant. A year before Brian, another inmate, Edwin Grant, collapsed in his cell after days of complaining about chest pain. He told officers, "I can't breathe." He told nurses, "My chest hurts." He told anyone who walked by, "Something's wrong." But according to the logs, he was checked regularly and showed no distress. The autopsy? A massive, untreated heart condition. His death raised questions, but not enough answers to spark reform. 3. The death of Melissa Missy Parker. Years later, Melissa Parker, a young woman detoxing from opioids, begged repeatedly for medical help. Her symptoms: vomiting, severe dehydration, confusion, delirium. Instead of treatment, she was placed in isolation. Staff believed she was acting out. Within 48 hours, she was dead. The investigation revealed striking similarities to Brian. No vital checks, medication, error, staff, skepticism of symptoms. The same mistakes repeated again. 4. The story of Joseph King, another preventable loss. Then came Joseph King, a middle-aged man suffering from severe mental health issues. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped responding. Staff labeled him non-compliant. They assumed he was choosing not to engage. But Joseph wasn't being defiant. He was in crisis. And by the time someone realized it, it was too late. He died of starvation and dehydration. Brian's autopsy echoed Joseph's almost exactly. The pattern could no longer be dismissed. 5. The connecting thread. Misinterpretation equals neglect. Different inmates, different years, different conditions, but the pattern was consistent. Symptoms judged as exaggerations. Medical complaints dismissed as manipulation, serious illness mistaken for behavior issues, delays in care, inadequate monitoring, incomplete paperwork, staff undertrained or indifferent. These weren't isolated lapses, they were institutional habits. 6. Inmates as witnesses, repeating the same stories. Cut to shadowed reenactment of inmates speaking anonymously. Inmate voice: "We told him he was sick. Nobody came." Another voice: "Every time someone collapses, the staff say they're faking." Another: "Brian wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last." Narrator: "Inside the jail, the pattern wasn't a mystery. It was common knowledge." 7. Staff turnover and chronic undertraining. Overworked staff, understaffed units, inexperienced medical contractors. These factors played a direct role in the recurring negligence. Training reports revealed new officers received minimal medical crisis instruction. Nurses often had no correctional health background. Mental health specialists were spread far too thin. When a jail lacks proper training, small mistakes become fatal, and fatal mistakes become routine. 8. A culture that discouraged compassion. Multiple investigations noted the same thing. A culture inside the jail that viewed inmate suffering as manipulation. Terms used by staff: "He's acting." "She wants attention." "He's exaggerating." "Just another inmate trying to get out of work." Detail. This mindset didn't just cloud judgment, it cost lives. 9. How patterns reveal truth. If Brian's case had occurred in isolation, it might have been dismissed as an unfortunate tragedy. But placed alongside the others, it revealed something much more troubling. The pattern showed predictability, repetition, systemic flaws, institutional indifference. Patterns are powerful because they expose what single incidents can hide. 10. The human cost behind the statistics. Cut to slow-motion clips of mothers, fathers, and siblings holding photos. Every death inside Broome County Jail rippled outward through families, communities, and courtrooms. Some families never received full answers, never saw accountability, never heard a sincere apology, never found closure. These were not nameless inmates. They were veterans, parents, young people battling addiction, individuals with mental illness. Human beings, all deserving of care. 11. Brian's case forces a new question. If so many deaths followed the same pattern, why wasn't anything done sooner? Was it bureaucratic inertia, protection of staff, lack of oversight, or simply indifference? Whatever the reasons, the consequences were undeniable. A pattern allowed to continue becomes a system, and a system that produces preventable deaths becomes a danger. 12. The chapter closes with a warning. Fade to black. Brian Tetrault's death was tragic, but the pattern surrounding his death was terrifying because it proved this wasn't one man's story. It was a symptom of a larger failure, a system that was breaking people instead of protecting them. And in our next chapter, we return to Brian to understand what his story changed and what it failed to change. The investigation turns neutral enough to use in both versions, but still intense, atmospheric, and investigative. When investigators finally initiated a deeper review of Brian Tetrault's final days inside the Schenectady County Jail, the first thing they searched for was clarity. But instead of clarity, they found gaps, frightening, widening voids that seemed to swallow every attempt at a straightforward explanation. By Chapter 10, the story shifts from medical failure and procedural negligence into something more structural, more ingrained, and far more disturbing. A system that had no intention of admitting its role in Brian's death. The review of the jail logs, something that should have been simple, became an exercise in frustration. Pages were missing. Notes were incomplete. Time entries didn't add up. Some lines appeared to have been added after Brian had already passed away, raising more questions than answers. Had staff begun reconstructing the narrative once they realized Brian's condition had spiraled beyond recovery? Or was this a pattern of sloppy record-keeping masked as standard procedure? What investigators didn't know was that Brian's decline should have been visible to anyone who looked at him. Days before his death, his hands trembled, his voice faded, and he could barely lift himself off the mattress. Fellow inmates reported hearing him whisper for help. Some said officers told them to mind their business. Others said they were threatened with disciplinary action if they kept pressing the issue. But even with multiple witness statements, the story inside the jail remained fractured. Each person seemed to have a slightly different version, but one thing stayed consistent. Brian Tetrault was visibly dying and no one stepped in. As detectives pushed forward, the question shifted from what happened to who knew. Because someone had to have made decisions about medication, about observation, about hospital transfers that never happened. There were signatures on forms, names on shift logs, reports that required approval. Someone at multiple points could have stopped the downward spiral. Yet when investigators asked for a clear chain of command, the answers blurred. Officers said they were following medical instructions. Medical staff said the administration set the rules. Administrators said officers should have intervened. Responsibility bounced between departments like a hot coal no one wanted to hold. What made it worse was the belated realization that Brian's condition, his rigid movements, slurred speech, and labored breathing, were textbook symptoms of complications related to Parkinson's and abrupt medication withdrawal. Any trained professional should have recognized it. Any competent facility should have had protocols to handle it. But this jail had neither the training nor the urgency required to care for someone in such fragile health. A quiet but glaring truth emerged. The jail was not equipped to handle medical cases, yet it continued accepting medically vulnerable inmates. Investigators discovered something else: the surveillance system. Footage that should have shown Brian's final hours didn't exist. Some cameras were not functioning. Others were overwritten automatically. The timing was uncanny. Too uncanny. It left investigators wondering whether this was coincidence or cover. By now, the forensic pathologist's findings had also been reviewed. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, muscle breakdown, a level of systemic deterioration that does not happen overnight. It happens slowly, painfully, with countless warning signs, every one of which had been ignored. The more investigators uncovered, the more the case felt less like a tragedy and more like an indictment of an entire institution. A place where neglect wasn't an accident. It was routine. Where suffering wasn't noticed because suffering was expected. Where paperwork mattered more than human life. Families of other inmates began coming forward, each with their own stories, some eerily similar to Brian's. Medical pleas ignored. Symptoms dismissed. Requests for treatment brushed aside. The investigators realized they weren't just documenting one man's final days, they were documenting a pattern, a culture, a system. And once you expose a system, it doesn't just collapse quietly. It fights back. Records were slow to be provided. Staff became guarded. Union representatives stepped in. Legal advisors inserted themselves into interviews. Everyone suddenly had something to lose. And yet, in the middle of this mounting pressure, one thing became painfully clear. Brian's death wasn't the result of a single failure. It was the result of 1,000 small failures, stacked on top of each other, until his body could no longer survive the weight. The walls close in, contradictions cover UPS, and a demand for accountability. Inside Broome County Jail, the hours and days following Brian Tetrault's death were supposed to be a moment of clarity, a moment for the truth to be documented, understood, and preserved. Instead, it became a maze of conflicting statements, a maze of altered records, a maze of people suddenly unable to remember what they saw, what they did, or what they failed to do. This chapter is where the story reaches its highest tension, the point where the system begins to turn inward, protecting itself rather than revealing what happened to a dying man in its custody. 1. The conflicting stories begin. As investigators start asking their first questions, something becomes immediately clear. No two staff members tell the same story. One officer claims Brian was alert during morning rounds. Another insists he was non-responsive. A nurse says she checked on him earlier, but can't recall what time. A different nurse says they never saw him that entire shift. Timelines overlap. Statements contradict. Memory suddenly blurs. And yet, the one consistent pattern running through all of these accounts is the same. Everyone insists they followed protocol. No one admits responsibility. Everyone pushes blame sideways or downward. 2. The first signs of a cover-up. As internal investigators examine the logbooks, things become even stranger. Entries appear to have been filled in after the fact. Handwriting is inconsistent, ink color changes suddenly, and timestamps don't match the facility's digital records. Some observations are oddly vague. Checked okay. Breathing normal. Inmate resting. But inmates in nearby cells claim the opposite, that Brian was groaning, vomiting, unable to stand, and begging for help. This is the first hint that the official story and the eyewitness reality do not match. 3. The missing pieces. When auditors examine surveillance footage, they run into more gaps. Parts of the hallway camera footage are missing. Some angles weren't recorded at all, or the footage malfunctioned. Other segments are blurry or overwritten. Then there are the medication logs. Some of Brian's doses appear marked as given, even though other staff on duty claim he never received them. One document even claims Brian refused treatment, a statement no inmate in his unit agrees with. The deeper investigators look, the more the paper trail begins to collapse. 4. Staff close ranks. As pressure mounts, something shifts inside the jail. Staff begin meeting with union representatives. Statements become shorter, less detailed. Some refuse further interviews without legal counsel. Suddenly, the language changes. I don't recall. I'm not sure. That wasn't part of my responsibilities. I wasn't assigned to him. I assumed medical had it under control. The phenomenon is familiar in institutional tragedies. The wall of silence. What began as contradictions now begins to look like coordination. 5. The political pressure. Outside the jail, the story begins to spread. Local newspapers publish early reports. TV stations pick up the case. Questions surface during county meetings. How did a medically fragile man die in a jail unequipped to care for him? Why was he denied medication? Why were there no hospital transfers until it was too late? County administrators start scrambling. Press statements are carefully worded. Officials emphasize ongoing investigations. They urge the public not to jump to conclusions. Behind closed doors, the priority becomes clear. Contain the fallout. Limit public outrage. Protect the institution. 6. The Tetrault family pushes back. But Brian's family refuses to let the case fade into silence. They demand records. They question staff. They contact lawyers. They refuse to accept vague explanations or bureaucratic excuses. They point out what everyone else is trying to obscure. Brian wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a danger to anyone. He wasn't even healthy enough to serve time. He was a man with Parkinson's disease. A man who should have been in a hospital, not a jail. In a system that should have cared for him. Let it die instead. Their determination prevents the case from being buried under paperwork and excuses. 7. Investigators find the pattern. As the investigation expands, a disturbing truth emerges. Brian's death is not an isolated incident. Other inmates with medical conditions have died under similar circumstances. Other families have lodged similar complaints. Other logs and reports have shown the same inconsistencies. The deeper investigators look, the more they discover a culture, not an accident, a culture of indifference, a culture of shortcuts, a culture where paperwork matters more than people. Brian's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of a broken system. 8. Tension peaks and the system trembles. By the end of this chapter, the story reaches a turning point. Public pressure intensifies. Legal threats loom. The internal narrative is no longer believable. Whistleblowers whisper that this isn't the first case and won't be the last. The walls of the jail, the walls that once protected silence, now trap a truth too big to ignore. Chapter 11 concludes with a sense of growing momentum, as the question shifts from, what happened to Brian? To, how many others did this happen to, and why was nothing done? The tension is at its highest. The system is cracking, and the final chapter will reveal what, if anything, actually changed. Legacy of a preventable death. Brian Tetrault's death shook Broome County to its core. What began as a tragic loss became a symbol of systemic failure and a harsh indictment of the correctional system in New York State. The aftermath: lawsuits filed, internal audits conducted, and public outcry forced officials to confront the reality of neglect. Jail protocols were revised, medical staffing increased, and oversight mechanisms slowly improved, but not fast enough for Brian. Accountability. Some officers and medical staff faced disciplinary action, yet many escaped significant consequences. The system, it seemed, could punish in small ways while leaving the larger culture untouched. Policy changes. Mandatory health screenings for medically vulnerable inmates, faster hospital transfer protocols, increased training for staff on chronic illnesses and mental health crises. But for every policy enacted, there remained the lingering question: how many lives were lost before reforms arrived? Brian's death, while preventable, became a catalyst, a warning that the cost of institutional indifference is human life. Family perspective. Brian's relatives became advocates for change, using their grief to push for stricter oversight. Interviews reveal their heartbreak, but also their resolve, ensuring that no other family experiences what they did. Closing reflection. Brian's story remains a stark reminder that negligence within correctional institutions is not just bureaucratic failure. It is a crime against humanity. His legacy lives on in the policies, in the awareness, and in the fight for accountability that his death demanded. Fade out. Brian's photograph slowly dissolving into images of empty jail corridors, underscoring the haunting cost of systemic neglect. Man Detective Mystery Version, Mystery Vault 80. Title: The Unsolved Mystery of Intent. Brian Tetrault's death is more than a story of negligence. It is a puzzle, a chilling enigma that still lingers decades later. Behind locked doors, questions remain unanswered. Was it pure oversight? Or was something more deliberate? The shadow of doubt. Every staff statement, every log entry, every altered record raises a question. Could misjudgments really have been accidental? Or was there a conscious effort to obscure reality? The investigation that faltered. While lawsuits and internal probes exposed inconsistencies, they failed to fully clarify intent. Official reports focused on process failures, not motivation, leaving the mystery unresolved. Unanswered questions. Why were key medical interventions delayed? Why did staff repeatedly dismiss clear signs of danger? Why do similar cases persist within the facility, even after reforms? The pattern. Connecting Brian's case with other inmate deaths suggests a disturbing continuity, one that seems almost deliberate in its neglect. The system itself becomes a character, opaque, indifferent, and resistant to full disclosure. Brian's story, in the end, is a haunting question mark. The autopsy told the body's story. The logs and reports told a different one. And the truth, whether accident, incompetence, or intent, remains just out of reach. His death may have prompted policy changes, but the enigma endures. Each unanswered question is a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors and the human cost of what we choose not to know. Fade out. Dim hallways, a lone prison cell door closing slowly, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of unresolved mystery.